Boker Tov. Today's Daf Yomi is dedicated for Shmira for Am Yisrael, Atzal Geula Yeshua, for the Chayalim and the Shvuyim. So we're going to start on Nudhei Amabeis. The Gemara is over there, Shia. Over there's the Gemara. So we're going to start on Nudhei Amabeis, 6 lines from the bottom. The Gemara tells us the following. Tanya, it says the Brisa, Amar Rabbi Yeshua, Arba Dvaram Ha'osa Osan, Pater Midine Adam, V'chaya B'dine Shemayim. There are 4 things that if you do them, you're going to be exempt from the laws of Shemayim, from the laws of heaven, exempt from the laws of man, but liable from the laws of heaven. These are the 4 things. Ve'eluhein, haporetz geder b'fnei behemoth chavero, somebody who breaks the fence so that the animal of his friend can now escape. Somebody breaks the fence so the animal of his friend can escape. Hakofev komaso shel chavero, somebody who bends down his crops in front of his friend's crops b'fnei adleika, in front of a fire, and thereby causes the fire to burn his friend's crops. HaSocher Edei Sheker Laha'id, one who hires false witnesses to testify. And one who knows testimony for his friend, but he doesn't testify for him. In all these cases, you're exempt from the laws of man, but you're liable by the laws of Shemayim. So what does it mean to be liable by the laws of Shemayim, by the laws of heaven? So the simplest way to understand it is that you're going to be expected to receive a divine punishment for not obeying these laws. Amar Mara, Poretz Geder B'fnei Behemoth Chavero. What's it talking about the case? You're liable by the laws of heaven, but not by the laws of man. If you break the fence in front of your friend's animal, hey Chidami, what's the scenario? We're talking about a very strong fence. Well, that doesn't make any sense. B'dinei Adam Nami Mechayev. Well, you should at least be responsible to pay for the fence by the laws of man. So what we're talking about on top of Bava Kamma is the Kos over Ua. Talking about a case where it was a bad fence. So by destroying it, you're not costing anything because it was a fence that was about to be torn down anyway. And so since the fence was going to be torn down,
where are you?
we're on the top of Nun. We're on the top of Nun Vav Amud Aleph. We're on top of 56a. So we're talking about a bad fence. So it was going to be torn down anyway. So what's the difference? So the Gemara says, okay, what about the next case? Why are you liable by the laws of heaven, but not by the laws of man? Somebody who bends down the produce of his friend's crops in front of his friend before a fire. You push down your friend's crops in front of the fire. Hey, Chidami, what's the scenario there? If you pushed it down in front of a regular wind that's bringing the fire, so you should also be liable by the laws of man. You brought it to the fire. Let's say you push it down in front of a wind that was not common. So that's the scenario that we're talking about. So therefore, you're liable only by the laws of heaven, but not by the laws of man, because it wasn't a regular wind. So you wouldn't have expected that the fire would come to that. Rashi says we're talking about a different case. Tamunit, we're talking about a case where he covered over his friend's crops with a sheet when he saw that the fire was coming to them. So he didn't send out the fire, and yet he made it so that it was considered like it was covered. And we know that the laws about fire is that you're exempt. The person who made the fire is exempt for things that were covered. And so therefore he caused his friend to lose the money because now this person doesn't have to pay him for the loss. Mishum deshavya tamam ba'eshi, because he made it like something that was considered covered by the fire. What's the next case where you're exempt by the laws of man but liable by the laws of heaven? Amar Mara sochar edei sheker, you hire false witnesses. Now, hey chidami, what's the scenario? If he hired them to make himself, if you want to say that he hired them for himself to say, I hire false witnesses to help me get back my money. Well, if that's the case, he should have to pay back the money. He should have to pay back the money. Good morning, Jeff. We're in 56a, around 7 lines on the top. Then he would have to pay back the money. He should also be responsible the laws of man to pay back the money that he stole by hiring these false witnesses. El Chavri. So he hired the false witnesses for his friend, and so he hired false witnesses to take out money from Ruvain to give to Shimon, and so therefore he doesn't have to pay because he wasn't getting the money, so he doesn't have to pay any money back, and he's not the one who testified falsely. In the fourth scenario, which we had referred to in the Braysa, Yodea Eidos Lechavero, one who knows testimony for his friend, Veino Meidlo, but he doesn't testify. Here too, we're saying you're liable by the laws of heaven, but not by the laws of man. But Maya Skina, what are we talking about? Elam of Beitrei, if we're talking about he was one of two witnesses. Pshita, it's obviously the case that he's liable by the laws of heaven. De'araisahu, it's a biblical law. And Wilya gave an asava, no. If he won't testify, he'll carry his sin. Ela b'chad, we're talking about a case where he was the only witness. And he thought, well, anyway, I'm only one witness. And so therefore, what am I going to do? But one witness could have caused the defendant to have to take an oath. And so therefore he's liable by the laws of heaven, because if he would have testified, the other person would have had to take an oath. And maybe he wouldn't have agreed to take this oath, and then he would have had to pay. And so therefore he's liable by the laws of heaven, but not by the laws of man. Gemara says, are these the only 4 cases where you're liable by the laws of heaven, but not by the laws of man? Visu Leika Va'ika. What about the following cases? And we're going to have 4 more cases. We know that there's a red heifer. In order to make a red heifer, you have to take water from the spring that was never used before. And also you have to take a red heifer that was never worked. So let's say you do work with these water or with the paraduma. How do you do work with the water? Rashi says that you use it for weights, like we learned to Maseches Gittin 53a, and therefore it disqualifies it. So let's say you take somebody's water for the paraduma, or you take their calf, very expensive paraduma, worth a lot of money, but you disqualify by using it. So therefore, we're going to say you're exempt from the laws of man and liable from the laws of heaven. What about the next case? You put poison in front of your friend's animal. There too, you could say to the owner of the animal, your animal shouldn't have eaten it. So you're you're exempt from the laws of man. But you're liable by the laws of heaven. What about What about this case, which you had was a good review of many other Gemaras? What about the case where you send the fire into the hands of a chereshot of a katan? So there too, we're going to say you're going to be exempt from the laws of you're going to be exempt from the laws of man, but liable by the laws of heaven, because the chereshot of a katan. Remember, we had seen that there are 2 ways to understand it. Either it was glowing, or you gave him a fire and you're not responsible. Remember, we had this dispute earlier. What about the case where you frighten your friend? That's pater midinei adam chayav b'dinei shemayim. You're exempt from man and liable by heaven. And what about the other case? And let's say you dropped your jug in public, below solka, and you didn't remove it. And then, or naflagam below amida, or your camel fell and you declared it onerous, you didn't stand it up. In those cases, Meir says you're liable on their damage, and Chum say you're exempt from the laws of man and liable by the laws of heaven. So we see that there was not just the 4 cases that we listed in the price, so there are at least 4 other cases. Meir says you're right. In Mia Ikatufa, there are many cases where you're exempt by the laws of man, but liable by the laws of heaven. Now, honey, it's trichoy, but why are we only mentioning these 4 specific cases? Because now the tema, you might have thought in these 4 cases that we mentioned, remember what the 4 cases are. The 4 cases are you opening the fence in front of your friend's animal, you bend down his crops in front of the fire, you hire false witnesses, or you don't testify. In these 4 cases, we're going to say, Hani you might have said, by the laws of heaven, you're also now responsible. You might have said, I have no responsibility here, even by the laws of heaven. Kamashmalan, you do. How so? If you open the fence in front of your friend's animal, you might have thought, because since the fence was anyway going to break, Ma'avid, what did I do? B'dinei shemayim nami lo mechayev. I didn't even violate the laws of heaven. Kamash one you did. The kofib komasu shachavero. If you bend over your friend's produce, nami ma'udatim, he might have said, Lema mi avi yadana da asya ruach shena mitzuyo b'dinei shemayim nami lo mechayev. He might have said, how am I supposed to know that there's going to be an uncommon wind and it's going to bring the fire here? I'm also not responsible by the laws of heaven. Or Ravashi Damar Nami Tam. And then according to Ravashi, he says you covered over the crops of your friend with a blanket and thereby caused the owner of the fire to be exempt. He says, Ma'adatema, you might have said, Ana kisuya kisite nilech. I was doing you a favor. I was covering over your crops. So Bedine Shemayim Nami Lo Chayav. I'm also not responsible by the laws of heaven. Kamash one you are. Well, you know the testimony for your friend, you don't testify. You might have said, Mi Yamar Dechiavi Mesadino, have a moda. So well, if somebody who knows I skipped the line. He says, "Vasochare de sheker." One who hires false witnesses. He might have said, "Lema divrei Rav, divrei Tama, divrei Mishomin, divrei Shemayim nami lo chayev." You might have said, "Listen, he should have listened to the master, not to the student. The words of the student, the words of the master. You listen to the master. Well, he shouldn't have listened to me. I'm not responsible even by the laws of heaven." And the fourth one is He knows testimony for his friend and he doesn't testify. Nami also he could have said, who would say that if I would testify, have a moda, he would admit it. Maybe he would have sworn falsely. So I didn't cause this guy to lose any money, so therefore I'm also not liable by the laws of heaven. Kamash Malan, we say you have liability by the laws of heaven. So the Gemara now goes on to the next case. It said in the Mishnah, if the fence broke at night, or if the robbers broke it out, or if the robbers brought it out, and the sheep goes out and do damage, the owner of the sheep is exempt because he guarded his sheep properly. Amarabba, so Rabbah says, what are we talking about? What's the scenario here? Rabbah says that which it says that if the fence broke at night, you're exempt. That's talking about a case where the hushachatra, where the animal dug underneath the fence and caused the fence to fall. Meaning to say it was an unusual act that caused the fence to fall. Of a lochatra, but meaning to say, Gemara says, according to Rabbah, if he didn't dig under it, we would say chayiv. We would say that Rabbah would say if the animal didn't do this unusual act of digging it, then the owner of the fence and the animals would be responsible. Hechidami. What are we talking about? If we're talking about a very healthy wall, well, if he didn't dig under it, why is the owner of the animal responsible? It was a very strong wall up there. What could he have done? It's completely beyond his capabilities. We're talking about a bad wall, so the Gemara says, well, even if the animal dug under it, amai pater, why is the owner exempt? Isn't this a case where it starts with negligence and it ends in an accident? Now, okay, makes sense according to one who says if it starts with negligence and ends in an accident, you're exempt. But according to one who says if it starts with negligence and ends by an accident, you're liable. What would you say in this case? Why would you say if it was a bad fence and the animal dug under the fence that the owner of the animal is exempt? There was negligence there at the outset. Now, since we go back to the first approach, the Mishnah is talking about a case of a kosel bari. It's a healthy wall, a strong wall. So if that's the case, I feel lo chatra, even if the animal didn't dig, the owner of the wall is going to be exempt. And when Rava said, no, if he dug under the wall, you're exempt, that was not said about the first clause of the Mishnah, a seifet mar. It was only said about the last clause of the Mishnah, where it said, that if you left the animal in the sun, or if you gave it over to a person who's not of sound mind, and the animal goes out and does damage, you're going to be chayiv, you're responsible. And says Rabbah, even if the animal got out by doing this unusual act of digging. Not only in a case where it didn't dig to kula pshiyahu, where basically you're completely negligent, but even if the animal escaped by digging under the fence, we're also going to say you're liable. What would you think? You might have said, oh no, at the beginning is negligence and the end is an accident. Kamash Malon. No, we're saying meaning to say you might have said according to the person who says it's exempt. according to that position, it says that you're exempt if you start off with negligence, but in the end it's an accident. Maybe if the animal dug under the fence, you're going to be exempt. Kamashma, we don't even say that. Why? The kulap shehi, because since you put the animal in the hot sun, the fact that the animal dug under the fence is completely negligent. Why? My time of the Amarlay made the yadas to keep in the Bava Kamma, because the guy whose produce was damaged by the sheep would say, you should have known, because since you left it in the sun, kol tatstaka the Israel me'eved avda v'nafka. The sheep is going to do it. The animal is going to do anything they possibly can to get out, because it's baking in the sun. It'll come up with any possible technique to get out. Okay, so now we're up to the next clause. The next clause of the Mishnah says, we learned in the Mishnah, if the robbers took it out, the listim chayavim, then the robbers are the ones who are responsible. The Lord says, Pshita, this is obvious. Given the Afkua, of course the robbers are responsible if the robbers took out the sheep. Since they took it out, Kimo Eber Shusayu, it's in their domain. Of course they're responsible. They did what Rashi says. They did a meshicha. They caused the animal to move, and they brought it into their possession. So it's like they acquired it. So of course they're responsible for the damages. So no, it's why do we need to say this? They didn't hit the animal to get it to move, which would have been a form of acquisition called meshicha, but rather they stood in front of it and directed it. They directed it by moving their body without actually touching it. If somebody stands his friend's animal, over another person's produce and causes it to do damage, you're responsible. So Gemara says, Mamid Pshita, obviously if you stand the animal there and cause it to do damage, you're responsible. Gemara says, no, it's Tzricha Kamma Ba'apa. No, you didn't actually touch it, you just directed it. And Amar Abaye Rav Yosef, Hikisha Amrslan. So Abaye says to Rav Yosef a different answer in Rav's explanation. That he gives us a different explanation of Rav of Rav's explanation of Rav's statement. He says, "You said, what are we talking about here? We're talking about a case of Hikisha Amerson, Listaname di Kishua. That basically we're talking about a case where the robbers hit it with a stick, and our Mishnah is teaching us that hitting it with the stick is exactly the case of Meshicha. That's exactly the Chiddush of the Mishnah, that hitting it with the stick, that is the Meshicha. So now we say that if you gave it over to the shepherd, if the Masra Laroa, that if you gave it over to a shepherd, Nichna Saroa Tachtav, that the shepherd stands in his place and the shepherd is going to be responsible for the damages. So Gemara says, Amri Tachtav Deman, the shepherd is standing in place of whom? Ilema Tachtav Debal Behema. If you want to say the shepherd is in place of the owner of the animal, and just as the owner had liability, now the shepherd has the liability. Tanina Chadazimna. We already learned this in a brisa back on Memdal and Masru Shomer China Moshol Nosis Sachar Sochar Kul and Nechnasu Tachas Balam. That if the owner of the sheep gave it to a guardian to watch, they all enter in his domain and they're watching it on his behalf and they're responsible. Ela Tacht of the Shomer. Oh, so we're talking about a case is you had hired or you had given it or you had asked a shomer, a different watchman, to watch it, and this shomer gave it to a different shomer. The guardian gave it to another guardian. V'shomer kama ipato elagamri. Gemara means to say, Gemara asks, you mean to say you gave it to Reuven to be your shepherd, and then Reuven gave it to Shimon, and now Reuven is completely exempt? Well, if that would be the case, well, if that's the case, our Gemara is actually a refutation of a statement of Rava. Rava shomer shemasa shomer chayev. Rava said if a watchman gave it to another watchman, the first watchman is still responsible. You don't have authority to start giving off your duties to other people without getting permission from the first one. So the Gemara says, no, what are we talking about? Rava, my masru. What are we saying here? Now, why is the second watchman responsible, not the first watchman anymore? But Barzilai, he gave it to his apprentice. Because the Orche de Roel and Mimsar Barzilai, you have to expect when you give it to a shepherd that the shepherd is going to give it to his apprentice. And so therefore the apprentice is responsible, not the original shepherd. Alternatively, Midikatani Masar Laroa, Vlokatani Masar Achar. From the fact, or alternative version of this discussion is from the fact that it says if you give it over to the shepherd, but it doesn't say you gave it over to somebody else. Shema mina, we learned from here, my Masar Laroa. What does it mean you gave it over to the shepherd? Masar Roa Barzilai, that the shepherd gave it to his apprentice, to Urche de Roa, because the manner of the shepherd is is to give it over to an apprentice. But if he gave it to somebody else, then the first shepherd would be liable. Isn't this therefore a support for Rava? That if a watchman gives it to another watchman, is responsible. And says no. Maybe it's just speaking in the normal manner. Or maybe it's just saying, well, normally you give it to an apprentice, but you can't necessarily infer that this is support for Rava's position. Now the Gemara is going to introduce us to a very, very, very interesting topic. Well, we're going to continue now on the Zoom, but I'm going to stop the recording because I'll record this all for tomorrow's stuff. So